Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, those of you in the room and those of you following along virtually. My name is Julia Levin, and I work with Environmental Defence Canada. Today's event is focused on phasing out fossil fuels here at COP28, on what needs to happen and who's standing in the way. So COP28 needs to deliver where past COPs have failed. We need countries to leave here with a collective agreement to phase out fossil fuels, with timelines and without any loopholes, and in an equitable manner, with wealthy countries like Canada leading the way and paying up. But there are many obstacles still standing in the way, not least of all the presence of oil and gas companies and their financial enablers, who continue to do everything in their power to sabotage climate action and extract as much profit as possible in the near term. So to explore these issues further, I'm really excited to introduce to you our excellent group of panelists. We'll hear from each of them and then turn it over to the audience for any questions. So our 5 panelists, not all in the right order, but are Zipporah Berman from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and Stand.Earth, Caroline Bruyère from Climate Action Network Canada, Carol Montour from Indigenous Climate Action, Joe Vibond from the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and Calgary Climate Hub, and my colleague Julie Siegel from Environmental Defence Canada. So let's start with Zipporah. Let's start with you. So why is it so important for countries to agree to phasing out fossil fuels here at COP28?
Thank you, Julie. After decades of climate negotiations, fossil fuels have finally been dragged center stage here at COP. The fact that we have had 28 COPs and all 28 COPs have refused to directly address the need for a phase out of fossil fuels is a result of the billions spent lobbying and public relations by the oil, gas, and coal industry. Climate policy and climate agreements are complicated, but what's not complicated is that 86% of the emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere today come from 3 products: oil, gas, and coal. The science is very clear. If we're designing policy and agreements to align with a 1.5-degree goal, no new projects, exploration, expansion, or financing of fossil fuel production from oil, gas, or coal is consistent. In fact, the data released this month by the United Nations Environmental Program and Stockholm Environment Institute in the Production Gap Report shows that the world's governments currently plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels between now and 2030 that would be consistent with a 1.5-degree goal. Current global plans and projections would lead to about 240% more coal, 57% more oil, and 71% more gas than is consistent with a 1.5-degree goal. So stopping expansion immediately is critical. At COP27, 80 countries supported language for a fossil fuel phase-out, but were defeated by a vocal minority and a reluctant presidency. So there is now a huge challenge to get a global consensus on phase-out language at COP. This creates the ultimate test for COP28. Can this process address the primary cause of the climate crisis? The COP28 outcome must support an equitable phase-out of fossil fuels and the need for a detailed, binding mechanism to negotiate and finance a global transition away from coal, oil, and gas. The outcome we're seeking at COP28 is one that recognizes the need to address all fossil fuels. One that recognizes the need to address the full life cycle of fossil fuels, including production, transportation, and consumption and combustion. One that recognizes the need to end the expansion of all fossil fuels, i.e. no new project, as a first step in the phase-out. One that commits to an equitable phase-out of fossil fuels without qualifiers or loopholes such as unabated in order to justify false solutions and delay, and clearly links the phase-out to equity and common but differentiated responsibility. An outcome that phases out all fossil fuel finance and subsidies without qualifiers such as inefficient. At this moment in history, in the climate era, there is no efficient fossil fuel subsidy. One that recognizes that a further detailed binding mechanism and process to negotiate the equitable phase-out and to realize the financing to resource a global just transition is going to be necessary. So paired with the fossil fuel phase out, we're also looking for a tripling of renewable energy capacity by 2030, at least a doubling of energy efficiency improvements from 2022 levels by 2030, a commitment to safe energy access for all, and the elimination of methane emissions from the energy sector by 2030. In the coming days, we'll be keeping an eye out on the negotiations for language that only focuses on coal, language that only focuses on the power sector, loopholes, as I've mentioned, like unabated and inefficient, or uses phase down rather than phase out, language that does not recognize the need to end the expansion of fossil fuels. Let us be very clear here. It is not a transition if countries are continuing to grow the problem. A further area of concern would be any language that provides justification for gas and suggests it plays a role in the transition. Gas is a fossil fuel. It's not part of the transition. An outcome reflecting these loopholes and weak instruments will be a failure of leadership at this critical moment in history. And we need more than words. We need plans. We need a detailed plan with timelines. And that's why we see momentum building behind the call for a fossil fuel treaty, now spearheaded by a growing bloc of 8 nation states, and more by the end of COP. These nation states are joining forces here at COP28 and call on other governments to join them in seeking a negotiating mandate for a new treaty on fossil fuels. As many of you may have heard today, Colombia is also poised to endorse the call for a fossil fuel treaty, and President Petro, along with other heads of state, will speak at a high-level event on fossil fuel phase-out on December 2nd. These countries are backed by thousands of scientists, over 2,000 organizations and institutions, including the European Parliament and the World Health Organization, and almost 100 cities and subnational governments, including California. Our planet is at a crossroads. Lives and livelihoods are at stake. And it's time for governments to take commensurate action, to stop throwing fuel on the fire and join the bloc of nation states seeking a fossil fuel treaty negotiating mandate to complement the Paris Agreement, to help us meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. This year broke records. The records broke records. Millions lost their lives due to lethal heat waves alone. If governments here at COP want to show that they care about people over profits, that they're committed to fighting climate change, they need to support an end to the expansion of fossil fuels. They need to ensure that they are showing us that they're committed to moving forward, that they're not just going to continue business as usual, that they will join together and push back against the power of the fossil fuel industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And diving into the country that many of us here are from, Canada, Canada is not one of the countries that's yet endorsed the treaty. We also, Canada as a wealthy country with a very low dependence on the oil and gas would be well positioned to lead the transition. But that hasn't been the case, and Canada on many fronts continues to be a laggard. So turning the word over to you, Caroline, what are your expectations, hopes for what Canada brings to COP on the issue of fossil fuel phase-out?
Thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. I want to start by saying that I've never been asked so many times why I'm at COP this year compared to other COPs. I will admit that I find this a bit strange. UN climate conferences are far from perfect, but a question that is being asked a lot less is who would benefit from civil society not being here? Fossil fuel lobbyists who have delayed and diluted climate action in Canada and across the world will be here in full force, and we cannot let them dominate these spaces unchallenged, especially when we are closer than ever to seeing an explicit mention of the need to phase out all fossil fuels in COP decision text for the first time ever. So the eyes of the world are on COP28 and on Canada, who is a rich country and a large fossil fuel producer and exporter. Canada is one of just 5 wealthy, high-emitting countries responsible for a majority of planned fossil expansion. These countries could and should be moving first and fastest on a phase-out of all fossil fuels. Canada also ranked among the top 5 worst countries in terms of new oil and gas extraction approved for development in 2022. At a time when we need a managed phase-out and a managed energy transition, Canada is still expanding production and stranding new assets. Oil and gas production is Canada's largest emitting sector. That is true even before accounting for the large portion of Canada's oil and gas production that is exported and burned beyond our borders. Last year at COP27, Canada joined in extremis this coalition of 80+ countries that Zipporah mentioned, calling for a phase out of all fossil fuels. However, the phase out that we've heard Minister Guilbeault promote this year throughout recent months is a qualified one, not the fair, fast, full and funded phase out of all fossil fuels that the world needs during this hottest year on record. Canada's pushing for a phase out of unabated fossil fuels, an outcome which would cast doubt on the scale of the decline in fossil fuel production that is needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And this is not surprising, as a new report published just recently suggests that Canada is second only to the US for spending the most public money on carbon capture and storage to date. What's even more concerning is that Canada, a member of the High Ambition Coalition, has very suspiciously not signed on to statements from the HAC that propose robust caveats to abatement, and I quote, "Abatement technologies must not be used to greenlight continued fossil fuel expansion and must be considered in the context of steps to phase out fossil fuel use and should be recognized as having a minimal role to play in decarbonization of the energy sector." So the fact that Canada cannot sign on to this very minimal, low-bar text raises some really concerning questions. What's more, domestically, we're seeing Canada continuously delay on a policy that was promised now over than 2 years ago at COP26, a cap on oil and gas emissions. We're really hoping that Minister Guilbeault will publish a framework on this policy with a robust target that calls the oil and gas sector to do its fair share of the national climate effort, because continual delay is unacceptable. Canada will need to make a choice at COP28. Will it push for a fossil phase-out outcome that is so cribbled of loopholes that it looks like Gruyere cheese, and that again leaves its powerful fossil lobby off the hook, while the rest of the Canadian economy, Canadian workers, Canadian consumers have to pick up the slack from its lack of climate action? Or will it side with people and communities from across the world who are suffering from the double whammy of climate impacts and fossilflation? The choice is clear, and that's what we'll be watching out for this COP. Merci.
Thanks so much for that, Caroline. So Caroline has mentioned some of the forces standing in the way of what Zipporah has laid out that needs to happen, a fossil fuel phase out. And we know, all of you have seen the presence of oil and gas lobbyists here pushing their dangerous distractions as a way to prolong our dependence on fossil fuels. Carbon capture is taking center stage here. We know that carbon capture is expensive, ineffective, and proven at scale when it comes to reducing emissions. But there are other issues with carbon capture, including the risks that these carbon pipelines and storage hubs pose to nearby communities. So Carol, what concerns you most about the false solutions being promoted here at COP28?
Hi everyone, Sego Segoguego. I'm from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, and we are the most populous First Nation in all of Canada. We are located within Southern Ontario, a region that represents 50% of the entire country's population. However, our ways of life as Haudenosaunee people are under threat due to climate change, unwanted development, and settler encroachment onto our territories. My community and other Indigenous communities in the region contain some of the last remaining stands of Carolinian forest. This is no surprise. After all, 80% of the world's biodiversity exists within Indigenous territories the world over. This is because of our relationship with the land as stewards that has withstood the test of time and remains intact despite centuries of colonization. My story and experience is echoed by Indigenous people, Indigenous nations across the world who are here at the COP. We are Mother Nature defending herself, and we are here to expose the colonial forces standing in our way. I believe in 2021, Indigenous people were the largest delegation to come to the COP after the fossil fuel industry. I have experienced the effects of climate change for the entirety of my life. At the same time, I have witnessed the continued failures of colonial political leaders to take real and just action on climate change. As someone who was younger than the UNFCCC COP process, I am beyond exasperated at the complete lack of action and continued delay to bring on real solutions to the climate crisis. While it seems that the UNFCCC does not result in meaningful climate action, the decisions made here by the parties on our behalf do have a real impact on our ability to enact climate solutions within our territories. I'm here participating in my first ever COP as part of the Global Indigenous Peoples Movement during the 16th anniversary of the signing of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We are here to demand the recognition of our unique and inherent rights as Indigenous peoples. We demand that colonial leaders put an end to false solutions that place an emphasis on trading or offsetting their emissions after the fact, using market-based mechanisms and unproven technologies instead of actually reducing them at source and keeping fossil fuels in the ground. My home country was founded and depends on resource extraction, both within its own borders and abroad. It is one of the highest emitting nations in the world, with, as Zipporah mentioned, plans to expand double fossil fuel usage into the future. They use these spaces to position themselves as global leaders on climate and as champions for Indigenous rights, while at the same time pushing forward greenwash environmental policies that seek to reduce the climate crisis to nothing more than an economic opportunity. And relying on false solutions such as hydrogen, biomass, carbon capture, and a carbon tax that commodifies nature by placing a price on the air that we breathe. We cannot use the same methods that created the climate crisis in the first place to solve it. Doing so only creates further delay that allows fossil fuel companies to continue business as usual and profiting. If we are serious about addressing the climate crisis in a meaningful way, we must reconcile our disconnection to the land and the impacts of colonialism in these spaces. We cannot continue to delay action and place this burden on future generations. The only path forward is Indigenous people leading climate justice for all. We need to phase out fossil fuels, place a moratorium on false solutions such as carbon capture, and demand transformative justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Carol. So we've talked about the oil and gas industry and the false solutions they're promoting, but it's not just lobbyists here at COP. We also have the presence of provincial premiers who are staunchly opposed to climate action, including Alberta and Saskatchewan. Alberta, Joe, as a resident from Alberta, what is Premier Smith doing at COP28?
Yeah, well, my illustrious premier is not alone. She's with over 100 different delegates that are representing the province, trying to push an agenda, right? They're trying to sell something. And so I only had one person ask me, or my two people ask me why I was going to COP, and it was my two daughters. Like, Dad, it's just before Christmas. Why are you going across the country? I'm like, well, because these 100+ delegates are coming here to tell a story. And it's not a story of truth. It's a story of wishful thinking and lies. And so I told my daughters, well, I'm there to try and counter the greenwashing and the attempt to continue the fossil fuel industry into the future. So here are some of the lies and greenwashing that we need to keep an eye out for. You're going to hear the terms ethically and environmentally responsible oil. Well, let's just recognize there is no such thing as ethically and environmental oil anywhere. It doesn't matter what basis of government you are. But certainly in Alberta, we don't have that. In fact, our Alberta energy regulator is pretty clearly captured by the oil and gas industry, and we're seeing that even as recently as the Kearl Oil Sands release, where Indigenous communities were impacted and weren't told for months because it was deemed more appropriate to keep this a secret. We have over 1 trillion liters of oil sands tailings lying in ponds, and we have no way of dealing with these. And the same Alberta energy regulator has internal documents saying that the environmental liabilities from this is $130 billion with a B dollars, and we have no way of paying for this. We have 4% of the amount of money tucked away for this. Yeah, environmentally responsible oil. Myth, net zero by 2050. In fact, I kept hearing my premier say the words aspirational net zero by 2050. What the heck does that mean, aspirational? It means they have no intention of doing it. There's no plan. You want to get to net zero by 2050? Show me exactly how it's going to happen. You can't just say the words aspirational. They're hanging a lot on CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We actually have 2 functional carbon capture, utilization, and storage plants in Western Canada. One's called the Quest Project, and one's called Boundary Dam. Boundary Dam has never achieved its carbon targets. It's going at about 50%. And Quest, which is apparently this amazing thing in central Alberta, is at 48%. In fact, Quest has released more CO2 into the atmosphere than it's ever captured. And this is what we're going to be relying on keeping our industry going ad infinitum. You know, I've been hearing about carbon capture and storage for decades in my province, and it's never happened because it's really hard. It's really hard to do, and yet that's what we're going to be achieving our net zero for. Myth. Alberta is a leader on climate. You're going to hear that. We're a leader on climate. This is the same province that just called for a renewable moratorium for seven months at a time when we need to accelerate our renewable energy. This is like 3 days ago, they said that they were going to do the Sovereignty Act to stop any kind of clean electricity regulations from being implemented. Clean electricity is how we get to net zero. If we don't have clean electricity, we don't get there. So yeah, myth, Alberta is a leader on climate. So let's be clear though, that Canada is not doing well because of Alberta. In fact, Alberta has had, right now, has 38% of all of our country's emissions, 38%. And it's increased 55% since 1990. So we're failing because of our province. So the reality is we need to phase out fossil fuels, we need to transition to renewable energy and energy efficiency, and Canada's not going to achieve any of its targets unless Alberta steps up to the plate and starts doing its job, taking responsibility for its past inactions and start doing what's right. So I told my daughters, I'm going because I'm scared. I'm scared because this last summer sucked. It sucked because of fires. It sucked because of floods. We are in big trouble, and unless we do something, it's all going to burn. So, Sadie and Willa, if you're out there, I'm here for you.
Thank you for that, Joe. And lastly, so it's not just big oil or terrible premiers here at COP28 blocking climate action. We also have big finance, and Canadian banks has been especially problematic in terms of financing fossils. So Julie, can you close us off with speaking to the role of the private financial sector here at COP28?
Most financial institutions have made commitments that they'll cut emissions in line with net zero, in line with what we need to do to keep 1.5 within reach. But most of those financial institutions that have made net zero commitments do not have commensurate plans. Financial institutions should only be showing up to COP if they are credibly aligned with cutting emissions in line with 1.5. Very few are, certainly very few Canadian ones are. Financial institutions should only be here if they're actually advancing on the goals that we've all just discussed of phasing out fossil fuels, and that is not what we have seen them here to do. Many investors come to COP simply to bolster their green credentials, perhaps to post something showing that they're engaged in this. But these badges are not a privilege for financial institutions to come and attend, but their responsibility to deliver the climate action that we need to see. Starting from COP26 with the launch of the Glasgow financial lines of net zero, financial institutions said that they were aligned with climate action. There was a big launch of saying over $130 trillion would be aligned with net zero. Yet at the same time, over $5.5 trillion have gone into fossil fuel investments since the signing of the Paris Agreement. A number of the largest financiers of fossil fuels are Canadian banks. Canadian financial institutions are deeply off track from climate action and are continuing to invest in the old polluting economy. Finance often says that they're simply investing in the diversity of the economy that we have today, right? That, for example, a Canadian bank is only investing in the diversity of Canada's economy. But we have to get real that financial institutions are not takers, but they shape what the market looks like. The investments that our banks or pension funds are making today decide what the economy looks like tomorrow. Canada's financial institutions are some of the greatest laggards on moving in the direction that we need to go. And new policy solutions are the way to fix that. When we're looking at COP28, there's the key pieces that come out of this conference, these negotiations. And there are the key pieces which financial institutions or oil and gas companies can be pushing for or holding us back from. And as we've seen in many cases, it's simply holding us back. What happens, though, is that all of the commitments made at COP turn back into domestic policies at home, and Canada should be taking that very seriously. Canada should be committing to phasing out all fossil fuels in the cover text and should be recognizing that that creates accountability to set new rules at home to align our public policies as well as our private financial institutions with that key goal of phasing out all fossil fuels. We need to change the conversation about private finance from saying that we need to mobilize capital or unlock capital to instead recognize that we need to hold private finance accountable for the climate action that we need to see. This isn't about private finance stepping up to the plate, but setting new domestic policies that deliver what countries have promised at the COPs. The systems that have interests via investments in the old polluting economy will not bring the new solutions that we need without rules. So what we need to see here is public finance, certainly phasing up in terms of investing in renewables, phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies, and setting new rules to ensure that our financial institutions are putting their money towards climate action, and if they're showing up at COP, are pushing for that proper direction.
And I think with these final few minutes, if there's any questions from the audience, especially journalists in the audience, do we have any questions? Just one there.
Thank you. John Woodside, National Observer here. Thank you for putting this on. Lots of really interesting perspectives. One of the things we heard today in the opening ceremony was the UNFCCC Executive Secretary saying that he expects countries to get started on new nationally determined contributions for 2025. That's obviously going to be a fair bit of work going into that. I was just looking to hear some thoughts about this effort to increase ambition. At the same time, we have these corrosive influences sort of across the board, from finance to fossil fuels to politics. What I'm getting at here, there is a hell of a lot of work to be done. We need to be signaling the end of the fossil fuel era. How does this fit in with the global stocktake from your perspective? What needs to happen next? It's an open question.
Go for it.
This year was the first global stocktake, and in that report we saw, again, another clarion call that we are way off meeting our targets. And in fact, the global stocktake identified fossil fuel expansion as one of the primary reasons that we haven't met our targets. What comes out of COP will set the guidelines for how those NDCs are put forward in the future. And that's what we mean by saying it can't just be words. There has to be guidance coming out of this COP that require countries to ensure timelines for a managed wind down of fossil fuel production and emissions. Academic research looking at the last set of NDCs looked at 190 countries, found, I think, 4 of them that had addressed fossil fuel supply at all in their NDCs. So it is a fallacy that we can continue to meet our targets while continuing to expand fossil fuel production And for decades, we've been hearing that from countries, not just because of their reliance on technologies that are not delivering, like carbon capture and storage, but also with the use of offsets and credits, which this year, again, the data is showing are not working. We need absolute emissions and production decline, and in the NDCs, countries have to submit a plan to ensure that. And this COP has to come out with guidelines that ensures that they do that.
Thank you, support, and last minute to you.
Thanks, John, for that question. I think we've seen so many gap reports in past weeks that the global stocktake needs to deliver more than showing us that we're off track, but rather tell us in a forward-facing way how we are going to drastically reckon with the moment we're in and change the dangerous trajectory we are on. I think it's important, because I heard that a little bit in your question, that we not oppose ambition and implementation. If we have a really good plan that leads us to the wrong target, and that goes for 2030 and 2035 as well, we're just going to be really sure that we're running right into a climate unsafe future. So we need both ambitious plans and ambitious targets. And I think we've heard on this panel many ways, many megatons that are at the Canadian government's disposal that they can go easily get through robust regulation. But waiting on industries, whether the fossil industry or the financial industry, to do that by themselves won't cut it.
We're at time, but I want to thank all our panelists for an amazing conversation about what COP28 has to deliver and what Canada can do to finally step up to the plate. Thank you, everyone.